to do my best in this
Just do some
role.
random nodding at random points, and I'll think, yeah, yeah, all right.
That's how it works, random nodding.
Well, you do that in a real talk, right? You kind of find this person in the audience that looks engaged. You're like, yes, I'm telling this story to you.
And just to you.
Just to everybody else.
Now I have the pressure.
Yeah, lots of pressure. That was the whole
Just
aim.
keep on nodding and you'll be fine.
Okay. I will train my neck at this point.
Right. Okay.
I probably won't see probably the whole collected by the entire presentation screen. I'll spotlight you and just
That's okay. You can spotlight.
Just have to have that one dedicated audience member.
yeah, and I know it's not going to be Stephanie. She'll just tune
Ah,
in. So.
Never. Right, the room is filling up. Everyone is co-host who needs to be co-host, so that should work. And we are live, so that is working nicely. So welcome to the CNS talk for which month? May. We're in May. And it's my great pleasure to have Nele Demeyere with us today. She's a professor for neuropsychology at Oxford University, an NIHR Advanced Fellow. She also heads the Translational Neuropsychology Group, where they look at cognitive impairments in stroke and dementia, and she co-chairs, because this is not enough yet, the Pheasant Stroke Interest Group together with Randy Stafford, and she's also a huge rugby fan and actively playing. So without any further ado, because I know there's a lot to get through today, the floor is yours, Nele. Thanks for joining us today.
Brilliant. Thanks so much. I was just saying to Stephanie, I managed to sneak in some extra slides of new things we're doing. And so that always means kind of end up with a new presentation. But that's good news for anyone who's heard my talks before. This won't be too repetitive, although some bits you may have heard. Right, let me share my screen, which I managed to do before. So that should work again. I say that. Okay. Right. Does that look all right?
Yes,
Because I
perfect.
can't see you guys anymore now. Okay, I'll just talk to my screen. So Lilith, you're off the hook. I can't see you, so you can you don't have to nod that hard. Okay, brilliant. So this whole talk is around whether routine imaging data can help unravel post-stroke cognition. So I head a translational research group, and so that means that our research is really concerned about making things that are applicable to real patients and real world data. So this kind of sits in nicely with how I view the use of imaging data as well. So in an ideal world, it can be used in the real world. So some of the questions we'll go through today is, first and foremost, what is it? What do we mean when I say post-stroke cognitive impairment? Why does it need unraveling? You might think, well, what is she on about? I'll tell you a little bit about the work we've done on developing stroke-specific cognitive screening, but then I'll quickly move on because this is about neuroanatomy, so you're probably most interested in the neuroimaging parts. And probably one of the big questions is, you know, we all know research standard is MRI. Can you even use clinical CT scans? One of the first reviewers I had said, oh, well, it's not because you have all of those CTs that you should be using them for research. And I thought, well, no, there's good questions to be asked. And I'll hopefully try and convince you that there is useful information in clinical brain CT, that we can get atrophy information, that we can get lesion information, that we can do lesion symptom mapping, that we can actually use those scans to inform profiling on cognitive impairment. And then this kind of more translational end, you know, can we use it for post-cognitive trajectory mapping, understanding of what's going on with this kind of routine data, routine clinical data. Okay, so to start off with, what is post-stroke cognitive impairment? So that very much depends who you're talking to and the kind of literature you read. If you're in clinical research and you read journals like The Lancet and BMJ, you will find out that whenever people talk about post-stroke cognitive impairment, they kind of focus on this dementia idea. It's really based on this unitary concept of cognition being impaired along with a functional impact. And then people talk about having post-stroke dementia or post-stroke cognitive impairments. If you're on the neurosciences end, you're probably much more thinking about very focal symptoms. You're probably thinking about spatial neglect. You're probably thinking about specific forms of apraxia, whatever your specific topic interest may be. And the kind of approaches you'll see there is this kind of lesion symptom mapping, very detailed syndrome explanation, etc. Now, I used to think those were like, they're talking about two very different things, but in fact, they're not, right? They're talking about the same patients. They're just being seen through a different lens. And the patient with aphasia may well be the same patient that then gets judged to have post-stroke dementia because of a cognitive impairment and a functional impact. So in brief, you get these focal impairments in language and perception and in attention, the things that neuropsychologists have studied for years through originally the standard lesion studies. High incidence, not surprisingly, people have had a focal injury to the brain, they will have a cognitive impairment. However, most of the stroke patients also have a backdrop of declining brain health. Most people have got a stroke because they have quite a few vascular risk factors, because they might already have small vessel disease. And at the same time, this kind of population, average stroke in the UK, for example, is 76. Many of these people already have comorbidities. They might have pre-existing dementia. They may have pre-existing other conditions. They might have Parkinson's and so forth. So it's a messy population. And if we want to study it as a whole, the stroke cognitive impairment kind of encompasses all of these things. So officially, people moved away from post-stroke dementia and now talk about post-stroke cognitive impairment within the realm of vascular cognitive impairment. And I don't want to go into too much detail, but really it's defined very broadly as anything that is not normal cognition with some vascular pathology. But that means somebody with small vessel disease and very mild level of impairment has got vascular cognitive impairment, and someone with a major stroke and major deficits, which might be degenerating at the same time, also has vascular cognitive impairment. So the problem then is that, it's not clear what about cognition is impaired. It's not clear what are the trajectories, what's going to improve, what's going to decline, over what kind of time. And patients really want and value that information and want to have an understanding about how things will progress for them. So in short, complex and heterogeneous cognition based on location and size of the lesion, but also this variable baseline, this comorbidities, these shared risk factors, and this kind of recovery and decline happening often at the same time in different aspects. Okay, so routine cognitive screening. Ideally, whenever someone's had a stroke, they get their cognition screened for, and they get their cognition screened for in a way that specifically assesses aspects of cognition that we know are highly prevalent after stroke. Does the patient have neglect? Do they have an apraxia? How is their perception? How is their vision? And so forth. So practically, though, if you work clinically, that's not always possible to do a whole neuropsych assessment. For those neuropsych people amongst you, often an assessment takes about 3 hours. Patients can't sustain that kind of burden, not in an acute stroke, and usually you don't have enough neuropsychology staff that will be doing all of these neuropsychological assessments with all of these people. So instead, we need short screening tools. Now, the short screening tools that are out there and that have been used and are mainly most common ones are made for dementia because they're screening for cognition. Remember those kind of BMJ Lancet journals? They're looking for this typical dementia profile, and all of that focus is typically on verbal memory. For example, the mini MOCA is basically, here's 5 words, remember them, and then you'll ask them again. They were never developed with stroke in mind, and they give you this cognition pass-fail in line with impaired, not impaired, what's going on. For example, if we take a look at the full MOCA, one of the most popular cognitive screening tools, also the one that Donald Trump was very pleased to say that he aced. that looks very different if you think about a stroke profile and a dementia cognitive profile. So whilst it has some subsections, so you can see these like little dark bars, visual spatial, naming, memory, you can't really do anything with the subsections because there's only norms and cutoffs for the total score, and it's taken as a whole score. So people getting 1 mark or 2 marks less in a specific task doesn't necessarily tell you that that specific subsection is impaired. Now, more problematically in stroke is that if you've got a patient with neglect, they will fail this task, not because they've got an executive impairment, but simply because it's on the left side of a very busy page, and they would simply not go to C, D, 5, and E because their attention is being pulled to the other side. So you have this contaminating factor, but more blatantly, you have language dependency. So anybody with left hemisphere stroke, anybody with language deficits tends to fail the MOCA, especially if they have a full expressive aphasia and can't speak, then the max they can get is 5 out of 30. Now that's led to some interesting consequences because there's quite a bit in the literature about left hemisphere most likely to have post-stroke dementia. And there's no particular reason to believe that the side of your stroke would affect the degenerative condition, except if you think about it in terms of how is it being measured, is being measured through verbal memory. Well, it's probably the verbal aspect more than the memory aspect that's being impaired here. So what we've been trying to do, and that's probably a bit of the kind of thread throughout this talk, is that we try and bridge 2 disciplines. So with the cognitive screening tool that we've made, we've tried to bring in neuropsychology expertise into this kind of broad global clinical world. And so with the Oxford Cognitive Screen, you kind of have a short screen that still does domain-specific assessment. So this is what it looks like. This is the kind of profile you get. It's meant to highlight strengths and weaknesses in 5 domains, and basically give you a quick overview of where the patient's impairments lie. It was made for stroke, it was made to be aphasia friendly, it was made to be neglect friendly. So by now it's being used as the kind of standard cognitive screen across the UK and actually internationally as well. There's about 23 available translations now, all of which have gone through renorming and revalidating for relevant populations. And so you can pretty much find it wherever you are. And if not, contact me and we can always see if we can start up a study to do another version. Okay, so now you know about the OX, I'll tell you a little bit more about the neuroimaging. So if we can do a little bit of neuropsychology input in terms of having domain-specific cognition with a standard clinical tool in the OX, what can we get in terms of standard clinical scans? Typically, again, if you look at the 2 aspects of research that goes on into this space, kind of more medical research almost always aims to do this vascular dementia risk prediction. There's a lot around predicting risk of dementia in the same way as predicting risk of dementia and Alzheimer's. The population in most of those studies tend to be really minor stroke, TIA, really trying to avoid lesions as confound. So they're trying to get a clean sample in their way of trying to just look at people with this kind of vascular load. Most of the focus on the imaging work is on white matter hyperintensity, small vessel disease imaging, inflammation markers, and so forth. If you look at the more neuroscience end, you will find that there is quite a different aim and quite a different population. The aim is usually to understand this kind of functionality of underlying neuroanatomy. If they talk about projections, it's not usually to determine risk of dementia. It's usually to understand what's the likelihood of recovery or the likelihood of persistent impairment. And it kind of looks at a very different aspect. There's not much of that, this kind of translational angle, but it's starting to come in more. The population that is used is people with brain lesions. You often see that they'll include stroke as well as other etiology. They'll just kind of focus on, we just want a clean brain with a single lesion. So first ever stroke, nothing else going on, excluding people with atrophy. So again, you know, trying to have a clean clean sample and avoiding these confounds. So they're really looking at quite different populations. So it's hard to compare these two. They're not quite a zooming in, zooming out, typically different groups. Right. So then you have to think, okay, if we're wanting to use clinical imaging, because both of those, the ones I talked to you about before, will all use high-level imaging. And of course, better imaging is better, right? I'm not going to try and convince you that a CT is better to have than an MRI. If I can have an MRI for my patient, I would like one, please. But it really depends what you want to do. You know, are you after the imaging to really understand the anatomical detail, the pathophysiological characteristics, or are you trying to use it for this kind of risk prediction modeling? Are you after these kind of white matter hyperintensities? Or are you trying to do some lesion function mapping? Are you trying to just get the lesion delineated? And those kind of different aims will mean different kind of requirements for your kind of imaging modalities. So, as I said, everybody agrees, we all want more detailed imaging. However, we have to be careful then where we talk about this, because the kind of research findings with these kind of data can only really generalize to the samples used. So with my highly translational and applied hat on, that is often problematic, because those research samples in both of those stories, both the medical stories with the very light cases and the kind of neuroscience stories with the much more typical stroke but nothing else going on, are very far removed from the clinical reality. The clinical reality compared to research samples is almost always that they're much older, they're much frailer, they're much more severe strokes. Often people have multiple pre-existing strokes, so a lot of the neuroscience research will always exclude people with pre-existing strokes because of the confounds, and will say, you know, first ever stroke only. But if you look on our clinical ward, about a third of patients, that will not be their first stroke. So it's highly common that people have pre-existing strokes. At the same time, all the multimorbidities I talked to you about in the beginning, but also these contraindications. A lot of patients can't have an MRI. They're too claustrophobic, they have a severe tremor, they can't get into the scanner for whatever reason that's going on just with their physical health. And the issue of cost, because, you know, ideally, yes, we would all have MRI, but not everybody can have it, but also not everybody can afford it. There's a big issue here on global health, and we're trying to understand how we can translate research findings to places where there is not even if they wanted to have access to MR, there isn't one. Okay, so all of this leads us to think, what can we do with a CT? Is there something in there? And then also, what are the limitations? We need to be aware about what we can and can't use from this kind of scan. So that's just a preamble to say I am highly aware, but I'm hopefully trying to convince you that you can get useful information for CT. So one of the main things that we've done with CT scan is to delineate lesions and do lesion mapping. So if you look at a CT scan versus an MRI scan, it is much easier to see a lesion on an MRI scan, but that doesn't mean you can't see it on a CT scan. Especially with practice and with experience, you can actually become quite good. Once you're getting used to CT, it's a bit like, you know, whenever we have a new student in the lab who wants to start learning, it's like human machine learning. You have to expose yourself to many of these examples and you start to see what is a lesion and what is not a lesion. And, you know, it's maybe a bit more subtle, these kind of contrast differences, but it's not invisible, and we can do quite a decent job. So yes, worse resolution, worse tissue contrast. There's some additional issues with CTs. If it's too early in after the stroke, you may not have anything visible because they don't become hyperdense till hours or even the day after the stroke. So if you have a very early scan, nothing might be visible just because it's not visible on CT yet, whereas it will be visible on MR. And then another complaint about CT delineation of scans is that you might not see the full extent of the lesion compared to MR. You know, the full end of the boundary might not be as clear given that kind of worse resolution and worse contrast. However, often CTs get repeated. So there's often early scan immediately upon arrival to emergency services to determine, is this a bleed or is this an ischemia? If it's an ischemia, you can treat different. Well, you can treat as opposed to on a bleed where you often can't do as much. So that's the key bit of getting the early CT. However, people often get repeat scans, and after that early CT scan, there's often another one. So if we only use the scans with visible lesions, we don't risk having these kind of false negatives if you want, because you would just exclude any scan that hasn't got any visible lesion. Also means it's very unlikely to yield false positive. If it's visible on a CT, it's probably most definitely there. So then when you think about what you do with the scans, if you do any lesion mapping, all of the pre-processing to move those scans into standard space, the warping, then afterwards the smoothing, really reduces that spatial resolution. And once you start using lesion mapping, you kind of have these spatial biases and noise, which don't matter. It's specific to the statistical analysis. It's not specific to the source. So we did this paper now 2 years ago, where we directly compared CT and MRI in lesion mapping, and I'll walk you through the rest of this presentation through a few of our papers. You can always read them in detail if there's a specific one you are interested in, because this will be like short summaries. So in that particular paper, we tried to understand if we could get some direct comparison of CT and MR for patients that had both modalities. So even though they automatically get CT in the clinical data that we're gathering, if they've gotten an MR, we'll also pull that MR. And so we'll have a series of patients that have both CT and MR. So all of those bits are in the paper. I'll just talk a little bit about this kind of lesion mask agreement. So this is data from 85 people that had both CT and MR. And these are some of our lesion mask comparisons. So these were done blinded and independently, and people weren't aware which scan was which, and so on. And as you can see, overall, it kind of relates quite well. There is some noise, and there's some specific outlier noises that we then looked at in more detail. So case one, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but it's like the little purple one on the left, turned out to have a much bigger lesion that was not visible yet. But because there was an older lesion already visible, they were considered to have a visible lesion. The lesion was delineated and was considered to only have that kind of left lesion. But actually, there was a new large lesion on the right that was missed. So that's just happenstance because there is more than one lesion, and it's not just first ever stroke. Then on the second case, we had the opposite, where there was an early MR and a much later CT, and actually the damage ended up extending quite a bit further than on the early MR because the lesion developed further over time. And so again, this kind of time at which you get your scan has a huge impact, maybe more than just a modality. So in summary from that paper, the timing of the scan really matters. Remember what you're doing with all your pre-processing and how that kind of exact boundary delineation maybe doesn't matter quite as much once you start moving it and warping it in that kind of way. And then the main conclusion from the simulations that were done on lesion mapping analysis, and I won't talk you through it, it's a bit too complicated to do quickly, but really the main conclusion was that actually having maximum sample size gave you a lot more power and information than having the specific imaging type. So this is where we thought it really matters, because you can easily get clinical scans and you can easily get large numbers, then that having that power is a very important aspect to consider for your study. So next, we did some papers, again, Margaret leading here on these kind of, can we do this kind of lesion symptom mapping, and how does it work? Does it confirm what we know about lesion function associations? So we obviously know a lot of aspects already through years and years of research of where functional specialization lies. And then the question here was, actually, can you pick that up in that very short cognitive screen? You only have 4 pictures to name. Would it pick up what you would expect to pick up in terms of the areas impaired and the locations that go with that? If it does, that really kind of validates how we see these domain-specific screening tools, because we can then kind of confidently say, yes, these are picking up on different aspects. And so it's a way of validating the screening tool, but also validating that kind of CT-based lesion approach as a valid approach if it indeed comes up with the things that we would expect it to do. Lesion symptom mapping, probably not the crowd to explain this to, so in brief is just kind of relating wherever a voxel is lesioned or not lesioned, comparing that to behavior being impaired, not impaired, then correcting for tons of multiple comparisons and ending up with a result that says this specific area has a series of voxels that is related to having an impairment as well as having a lesion here. So this study was on 573 acute OX data. So mind you, these are only scans with visible lesions. So any scans with non-visible lesions were not included. Only lesions with more than 5 lesion overlay visualized. So this is a very busy scan, and I won't go in detail, but in essence, what you'll find is that for the different tasks within the OX, even though each of them only had 3 or 4 items, you find that you can find these very separate, distinct lesion correlates, which make a lot of sense. We followed this up more recently with multivariate mapping, with network disconnection results mapping, and basically use these kind of more modern approaches to find very similar findings in that these different very short tasks are related to network disconnections and multivariate lesion mapping in the way that you would expect. So in short, what that meant is that we can say, look, the OX seems to indeed be domain-specific bedside, and it is picking up on differential impairments with differential tasks. And this CT-based lesion mapping technique seems to be a valid approach, and maybe we should consider it for other clinically relevant lesion mapping studies. On the back of that, Margaret and Chris and Jason and myself wrote a practical and conceptual guide to lesion mapping. So if you're really wanting to get into it in more depth and you're interested in lesion mapping, this is probably a nice guide for early career researchers to follow. And it kind of goes through a series of different ways of doing lesion mapping and explaining it in a nice kind of tutorial way, I think. So what else do we get from CT aside from the lesion? Well, we should be able to get some atrophy measures and some white matter hyperintensity measures, we thought. So on the physicas, which is a classic clinical scale for white matter hyperintensities, people grade from 0 to 6. Don't know how familiar you are, but basically you're grading both the periventricular white matter and the deep white matter in terms of the level of thinning that you've got. That was already validated for CT by a series of other people, so we did not separately validate. So you can find, for example, a paper here, but there's many others that kind of show that you kind of get quite reliable markers on visual ratings, on physicas, on CT. So if you stare deeply at these CTs, you will see that, again, the contrast is not that nice. It's harder to see, but it is absolutely doable. And again, with exposure, and if you get used to CT imaging, you will find that you can definitely identify these deep white matter scores and periventricular white matter scores. On the GCA, this is the Global Cortical Atrophy Scale. So that was one that hadn't been validated in CT. So usually people use a much broader scale of atrophy, like not that many points, but this is one that they use on MRI because it really goes into separate regions and you can get nice detail about where the atrophy is most severe and which kind of areas this is. And so you get it for each of those. You get this absent, mild, moderate, severe, and you get a nice score up to 39. So if you're interested in stats, this is much nicer variance to work with than just going from 0, 1, and 2. So we did some ratings and found that there was reasonable agreement between CT and MRI derived measures of GCA. And so again, this is not perfect, but we thought, well, it does look fairly well aligned, and we've taken it as some kind of show of evidence that we can perhaps start using at least as some measure that will give us an idea of atrophy, even if it's not as perfect. So this is a current project. So this is just been pre-printed and it's in review. And I just added that this morning because I kind of wanted to talk to you about this one. This is where we try and take all of that into account. We can take the lesion, we can take the atrophy, we take physique scores, and we try and understand, what are these different profiles that we can find post-stroke and how are they related to these different aspects. So this is work mainly by Hannah and Margaret. And so we start off from the behavior. So we start off with behavioral OX data that we have collected across the UK and Belgium and Italy in over 2,000 patients. And so we apply latent class modeling to understand how many classes really are in these kind of combinations of impairment, because very typically people won't just have one problem. If you say, look at this Oxford Cognitive Screen, in this case, they would just have a language problem, but often people will have a problem with naming and with reading, and also maybe some right lateralized neglect, maybe some apraxia at the same time. So you kind of get these profiles of combined impairments. And so we're trying to understand, can we set out different profiles? How many profiles are there? And then how does that relate to lesion information and atrophy information and demographic clinical information? So the neuroimaging we only have in a subset. So this is 515 patients. This is the UK data that we've previously talked about. It's a little bit more than what we had before. And for that, we have expert ratings of GCA and physicas. Someone's gone through and done lesion mapping and lesion delineation, and then added it and compared to the tractography atlases and the functional connectivity atlases. So you get these edge disconnections for every person in this subgroup. This is what our data looks like. So this are the 515. So you have some idea of where the lesions lie. Unsurprisingly, centered around the middle cerebral artery strokes, which are the most common, but getting quite good all brain coverage in the minimum. So that's anyone had to have at least 5 for them to be included. So any area that didn't have 5 people in it wouldn't be included in the power. So what we ended up is 2 solutions on this latent class modeling, a 5-class solution and a 13-class solution. Both of them provide best fit. It just depends how we define best fit. So if you take the 5-class solution, that works best according to the BIC index. And basically, if you think about the BIC index, added it both for my own memory and for your education, it penalizes models with more parameters. It really encourages parsimony and prevents this overfitting. So then you only have 5 classes. Say these are the 5 behavioral profiles. If you look at best fit on the AIC and the likelihood ratio test, given the complexity of the model and the sample size, you get a better fit to the data, and you kind of get this kind of balance of complexity, and you get a bit more in-depth information in these 13 class. So in the paper, we present both rather than argue for one or the other. It just depends on how much you want to zoom in and out, is kind of probably how we see it. Now then, for each of those classes, you can look at lesion characteristics, brain health, and age and education. And I'll just show you a few. There's more, so if you're interested, check out the preprint. The 5 classes behaviorally kind of distinguish into pretty much memory impairments, people with left neglect, people with language impairments, people with no impairments, and then kind of attention exec impairments, but not lateralized, not neglect. And so those were kind of the 5 behavioral profiles, roughly. If you look at the 13-class solution and you try and kind of group and see what's going on there, you can see that there were left lateralized profiles very clearly, and those kind of different left lateralized profiles kind of dependent on whether or not they had right neglect alongside or not, whether their aphasia was global, whether it's more expressive, more receptive. And so you can see that kind of those left lateralized. So if you want that 5-class solution that where they stick all the language together, you can kind of see these different aspects of what the kind of language impairments are, different profiles within. Same on the right lateralized, you kind of, depending on combinations of egocentric, allocentric, how severe the neglect is, just attentional, but no lateralized neglect, and so on. And then also 5 completely non-lateralized profiles, which were much more to do with global performance, overall memory, executive function, seemingly low education. And I'll come to that with some examples. So I picked a few out. I know this is highly busy. Take your time. On the left, that little plot kind of has, so the gray line will always be there. That's the group line. That's kind of overall probability of impairment for everyone in the 2,000 and 100 and something people. And then the colored line kind of denotes where people's impairments lie. So on the bottom, you have the different tasks in the OX. So this kind of pink line shows you, in general, they're doing quite well. So the line is overall under the gray line. So most of these people are behaving very strongly on the cognitive tasks, except for the naming. So that first one, the reading, the writing, those kind of two pink ones that are on top. That's it. So in a way, this kind of class is quite a specific class. So there was 198 people that kind of fit this class. So it's not a small group of people. And kind of define them as expressive language only. And now these are just kind of working terms to try and give a name to one of these classes. And for those, if you then explore all of these different aspects, you see, more likely left hemisphere stroke. In the lesion mapping approach, you can see these kind of voxel clusters that fit with this profile. And then you can see in the disconnections which ones fit most and which kind of default network. In this case, this left hemisphere default network was most impacted for this class of people. Here's another example, another left lateralized one. Now, if you look again at this leftmost graph, you will see these people are much more impaired in a way. So many of them are falling above that kind of line, and particularly on all of those language domains, but also the memory one. So VMEM is verbal memory, episodic memory. But then in addition, they have right egocentric neglect, both on the ego one in particular, and then more likely also to have allocentric, so object right, ego right, those two last dots on the side. Now, that kind of behaviorally defines this group. And then if you look what that looks like, you'll see, more likely left hemisphere, more likely higher atrophy, more likely lower educated. So it's not just the lesion, there's quite a few other things that distinguishes the group. One more. This is another left lateralized profile. I told you I did this specifically for Stephanie to show all the language ones, although I've not shown all of them, but there's at least 3 of them. And what you find here is, very, very high probability of impairment. It's a smaller group, 107 people belong to this class. Most of them really impaired across the board, and this kind of global aphasia issue, which affects number and memory and praxis, and again, right-sided neglect. And these people have got much more severe impairments, and you can also see lots more clusters involved, larger lesions, and also higher atrophy as well. Now then, here's an example of a non-lateralized profile. These are the people with no impairment. So we definitely have quite a big group of them as well. So almost a quarter of our people have very little impairment or very mild impairments, and generally classified as people with low probability. Overall, they have smaller lesions, they have better premorbid brain health, so lower physicas, lower GCA, and they're much more likely to be younger, they're much more likely to be higher educated as well. And finally, another non-lateralized profile. So here you can see it's bilateral, it's not lateralized to one side. They're just generally much more likely to have impairment within number and memory domains. They have much higher GCA ratings, more likely lower educated. In the subgroup, we didn't have enough lesions to do a proper statistical lesion test, but you kind of see this overall patient group with an overall impairment that's probably not related to the stroke. So then Hannah did some very clever multivariate similarity analysis. I'll let you read the preprint to get the detail of it, but what it comes down to is to say, okay, how similar are the cognitive profiles, and is that explained by the similarities in lesions? So on the left, you will see this kind of association, and so higher is better, and you will find that in general, the lesion overlap, the lesion volume, the tract disconnections, the network disconnections, they're all kind of in that range up to 0.15, which is quite low. Basically saying, you know, the lesions explain a little bit, but don't explain that much about how these cognitive profiles relate. And given what I've just told you about all of these other things that impact age, GCA, education, etc., you're probably not surprised that the lesions themselves don't explain that much. And you can start to see that when you start to subdivide the groups up and say, okay, let's subdivide the people up and have a look at people with mild, moderate, and severe brain health markers. So this is just a combined score of GCA and physicus. And you'll find that for those with the most severe brain health markers, actually the relation to lesion is a lot lower. And so it's much more than about the brain health as a whole than it is about the specific lesion. Okay, last point. Let's see. We're doing okay. I have time. We'll be running in time. So this is about translational work, and I probably want to acknowledge some amazing work in this space, both in terms of clinical research. There's a lot of really big studies, interesting studies on dementia predictions post-stroke that take into account really complex cohorts and lots of variables. And on the flip side, in the cognitive neuroscience research community, there's a lot of work similarly that then focus on recovery prediction, not dementia prediction, doing high-level imaging and network disconnection. So, for example, some of the work from Michelle and Stephanie and Maurizio kind of speaks to that and kind of tries to do this deficit prediction from these functional and structural disconnections. So the note to say here is, yes, very cool work, however, not very applied. Because if you look at the sample, they're typically very, very young. They're only first ever stroke. Understandable, because they're trying to, you know, get rid of the confounds. But also the variance explained remains quite small. And it doesn't include these kind of clinical variables. And so the question always, when I read these papers, is, so how much does this disconnection explain over and above these kind of demographic clinical variables, brain health markers, and acute cognition? I'll come to acute cognition in a second. And I think there's some way to go there. And I wrote a little bit about it more if you want to read my ramblings in more detail on you know, what we see as maybe what do we need before something can actually be translated into real world clinical appliances. So one of the basic things that we should be doing is really looking at acute cognitive screening to predict cognitive outcome, because it's the most predictive factor. So that's something we found, that's something other people found, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about next. So the question here is, you know, if you have this early cognitive screening info, how much does that help you to explain long-term cognitive outcomes? Now, the note, again, me being very pragmatic and applied, this is cheap, right? This is an acute behavioral screen that takes 15 minutes to do. This is not an expensive thing to get, and it will be part of standard clinical practice, standard clinical notes. So this is data from our screening program where we saw people acutely, and then again 6 months later, where we saw them and did cognitive screening acute and then 6 months later. And this is the first model we made, which was based on standard clinical, that kind of risk prediction work, where you look at all of the vascular risk factors and all of the things that you would expect to contribute to risk prediction. And what we found there in this base model is that only really age explains and predicts cognitive impairment at 6 months. And this R-square is about 10% of the variance that is being explained by it. Now, that's not great. And that's not that surprising that older people do worse. Now, when we add in acute cognition, that's quite a dramatic jump. You can explain a lot more of the variance in outcome, and it's the most predictive factor. Now, systematic review, looking at these risk factors for cognitive impairment, this is, again, in the more clinical research world, really showed that if you look at these kind of risk ratios, so on the bottom axis, you see this pooled risk ratio of studies on post-stroke dementia. On the left, pooled risk ratio studies on post-stroke cognitive impairment. the things that most of these studies are concerned about are these vascular risk factors. So white matter hyperintensities, diabetes, hypertension, but the one that explains the most, baseline cognitive impairment. So it's the most predictive factor to know whether someone showed this acute cognitive impairment into understanding whether or not they will have a problem 6 months down the line. So this has got some real clinical implications, also really extends the focus away from medication management, because one of the reasons that the main interest has always been in diabetes and hypertension is those are things that people can intervene on, right? These are modifiable risk factors. Now, baseline cognitive impairment is not a modifiable risk factor, but it at least would allow you to monitor people who are at high risk. So one more paper. This is a paper we did, what got published in Neurology, and this is again trying to make the case that these kind of non-stroke markers are also important for cognitive outcome. So the question here was, does the severity of atrophy and white matter hyperintensities that you can see on an acute CT, so, you know, all of those limitations, does that predict whether the severity of the acute post-stroke impairment and then 6 months down the line, what people have in terms of cognitive recovery? So for this, again, you just have total number of tasks impaired as like a shorthand for severity of cognitive impairment. And then you have neuroimaging rating scales to get that GCA and physicas. And so just as an idea, this is our sample in terms of the kind of proportion of people that have these different ranges of GCA and physicas, just to show that we have quite good range. So there's quite a lot of people with significant atrophy and significant white matter hyperintensity. It's a very mixed real world sample. So this is not a very mild group with everybody having minor levels of atrophy and white matter disease. If we look at acute OX, no association. So to me, no surprise, because, you know, you have just had a focal major stroke, and probably the thing that's driving your focal impairment is the focal stroke rather than your overall brain health. However, when we look at 6 months down the line, we find a small but significant contribution of GCA in terms of likelihood of long-term chronic cognitive impairment. So I'm showing you the mess because it is messy, but nevertheless, there's a significant line there. And actually, when you break it down, as we would do in neuropsychology, we find that the domains that are most impacted are memory and attention. Unsurprisingly to neuropsychologists, but nice to understand that the thing that's impacting the likelihood that you will have persistent problems in memory and attention. So you're less likely to recover from your acute impairment if you have high levels of atrophy and high levels of white matter disease. So acute, there's no impact of, or there's no prediction from brain health matters. But yes, at 6 months, you get global cortical atrophy in terms of memory and attention domains. Now, what I'll come back and talk to you about maybe next time is work we're doing at the moment, which is bringing all of this together, because that's probably what you've been thinking, having listened through all of this. Okay, so where's the study that does acute behavior, because you say that matters, lesions, because you say that matters, brain health, because that matters. So all of them look at different aspects, but really we should try and put them all together to try doing these trajectory predictions to come. So if you've slightly fallen asleep and you're just waking up now, this is the short summary. Maybe you can tag it in the YouTube to just say, you know, speed forward to this just to understand what was this talk about. On the routine imaging, CT remains the core imaging modality in clinical practice. It is what everybody's able to do. It's not affected by motion artifacts in the same way as MR. So for anybody who's got tremors, can't lie still, has pacemakers and so on, you will have a CT. It's cheap, it's fast, it's inclusive. And that CT carries info, and you should consider using it. You can definitely use it for lesion delineation and lesion function mapping. And I think we've done some nice work to show that that's a valid approach. You can use it for visual rating scales, including these kind of more detailed ones like GCA and simple physicas. And we can and should be using stuff like this for research. because if we do, it has got real translational value, real implications for real world research, including global health. A final bit of closing thoughts. A lot of what I do is bridging disciplines. I end up talking to people in the neuroscience community, and I talking to people in the medical community, and both of them could learn from each other. The clinical stroke research really could really take into account some of this focal injury, these disconnections, these lesion information, move beyond cognition, maybe mainly to understand and unravel cognition, what is going to recover, what might decline, what might stay stable. And then the cognitive neuroscience research, I read many a grant application that says it will have translational value, many a discussion that says, oh, this will be useful in clinical practice. But for that to be really true, really you need to have some more clinically relevant samples and try and account for these covariates and this noise and these confounds rather than just excluding them. So that's probably the message of the day. So thanks very much to the funders, to the team, to all the collaborators, to all the people who actually know imaging. So if you have questions, specifically technical ones, I'd probably refer you to them, but happy to take general questions. That's it.
Amazing. Thank you so much. That was a lot. I'm impressed about the sheer volume of patients that you get to work with, and the thoroughness of the comparison. So at this point, I invite everyone directly here in Zoom to raise their hand to ask questions directly, but also the people watching on YouTube to type their questions, and then I will bring them in here. And I already have a list of questions that were sent to me from people who had to leave early to pick up kids. But Lilith has her hand up, so take it away.
I thank you for this talk and the great work that you've done. I have a question on these 13 clusters. The one I was wondering, because that was a data set of 2,000 patients, right?
Yeah.
So I was wondering if there were some strange and interesting cases where you have right lateralization, right strokes, but at the same time, language impairments, for example. If you notice out of those 2,000, if there are some cluster like this. Yeah.
So it didn't come out as a cluster, but that's because, the way the cluster models is still trying to be parsimonious, even though not as parsimonious as the 5. But even in the 13, I think the smallest cluster had like 90 people in it. So it's still, and we wouldn't expect to see that in 90 people. So there are definitely some cases like that because I've seen them myself. So I know they exist. But we'd have to scroll through the data to find them. And they didn't come up as a cluster because there's too few of them. So yeah, this kind of latent class analysis still trying to cluster into chunks, and anything that's too small would have been kicked out basically, or well, would have been chunked into another class. Yeah.
But also you said that you took only those that had more than 5 overlap of the lesions.
For the lesion analysis, just for the lesion analysis. Yeah, sorry. No, so behaviorally they're all in. The 2,000 and something are all in, but we even only had scans for about 500 of them because we didn't have scans for anyone on the Italian cohort or the Belgian cohort. So it was just the UK scans that we had access to. So it's a subset of scans and only did the lesion mapping if it was powered to do so. So some of those classes will say, look, that we just didn't have power to do the lesion mapping because we didn't have enough overlay.
Okay. And another question, if nobody wants. So about this, about the OX testing. So I was wondering the choice of the big groups of the cognition kind of. So why, for example, perception is not as a separate chunk? I guess it has to be separate from attention, and also why attention and executive function are in a separate. So and why numbers is in a separate group as well. So I was wondering what was the logic behind of this.
Yeah.
these groups?
It came, so the background to the Ox is that it came from the Birmingham cognitive screen, which is the screen that Glyn developed back in Birmingham when I was doing my PhD. Oh, I don't know, 2008, some time ago. And when they developed it as a cognitive screen on all of these kind of domains. But it took more than an hour. So when you take that to clinic, people are saying that is not a screen, that is an hour assessment, that is not a screen. So when we made the cognitive screen that we've got, it was basically derived from that data that we had about 1,000 patients that had done the hour thing and kind of simply did factor analysis to determine which ones were the most heavy loading on the different domains. And that's what ended up being included, as well as based on guidelines, you want to screen for apraxia and you want to screen for the simple things like can the patient read and write? All of the things that aren't included in dementia screening when it comes to stroke. It's really important to know if the patient can read or write, just practically. So yeah, those things became the core domains being assessed. So there's a long history in how it got to where it got. And there's many things that could have been in and that weren't. I get asked all the time about processing speed by all of the executive people who are like, but processing speed. And yes, it doesn't have everything. So it's really meant as this kind of first line. People have just had a stroke. What are the major issues here? It's quite gross, it's not a detailed, it's not a neuropsych assessment, but it will tell you these are the issues and does in a way that matches known lesion mapping, does in a way that now we have these kind of cool little profiles that make sense, that right neglect goes with aphasia, those things are not unknown, so it's quite nice to see it fit with what we expect it to fit. Yeah, sorry, that was a long.
Yeah, no, it was perfect. Thank you.
And it's about 15 minutes, you said, right?
Yeah, it's really short. It's like, it's 15 minutes. It's done acute. It's mainly done by occupational therapy, not by psychology, because many stroke wards don't have those numbers of neuropsychologists, except in the Nordic countries where they all have them. Go to Denmark, they're like, yes, we have lots of neuropsychology in here. So I don't know what the situation is in different countries, but often they only would see people with complex needs rather than anyone and everyone for a brief cognitive screen. So OT tends to be the one.
Was that all your questions, Lilith, or do you have more?
Well, if nobody wants, I have another one.
I love this. Lilith's like, I'm going to take this. I did the nodding.
I did. No, I don't know.
Couldn't see anything.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned this these differences between real world clinic and what in research we are trying to separate and have clean cases of stroke with the first. So, for example, those 2,000 patients, they were also first stroke, or they were also had
anyone and everyone coming
atrophies. So it was just
inclusive
okay.
recruitment, very much, and that's why you see those classes. You see these different profiles because a lot of them will have had pre-morbid decline. It's literally anyone coming through the door.
But even like somebody with tumors
No,
as well, or
I mean, it is possible that there might be one person who had a pre-existing tumor and then had a stroke who would be in, but that would be very, very rare. So typically it would just be anyone coming onto the stroke wards. They would have to have had a stroke, but they may well have had a previous stroke and previous brain damage for sure, which then would get delineated as well, right? And that's why you look and you see, oh, you've got all these patients with bilateral strokes. What is this? Are they all brainstem? No, they're probably previous stroke on the left, current stroke on the right, and then a third stroke on here. So you get these multiple lesions per patient. Not all of them, just a chunk.
so would you then say that those studies that try to take those very pure cases would be not useful at all.
Oh no,
Then,
no. So I don't want to sound too critical in terms of the science. It's cool, right? You know, I've spoken to Maurizio many times about and yeah, you know, they expressively exclude because they want the clean sample. They want to say just what has this stroke done, which is scientifically really valid, right? And you want to get rid of the confounds. But if you then want to say, oh, I want to use someone's stroke lesion, stick it through this connectome, stick it through these things, and then predict their cognitive outcome, well, you can only then do that with your 50-year-old patient that's just had their stroke and nothing else. And that's a very, very small proportion of the clinical reality. So it's when people make claims about, oh, this could be used translationally and clinically, that's when you have to say, hang on, no, unlikely. That will be helpful. More likely you get more information just by sticking in people's age and people with atrophy and, you know, multiple strokes versus single stroke, you know, all of those things in terms of the clinical research, that's one of the biggest predictors of poor outcome. If it's not their first ever stroke, they're much more likely to have a poor outcome. So there's just a lot more clinical information that would need to be accounted for if you want to do translationally valuable prediction work. Not if you just want to understand what does a specific stroke mean in terms of neuroanatomy and in terms of effect on patients. Sure. I mean, brilliant, of course, much more clean than the mess. But yeah, clinical translation requires you to deal with the mess, not to ignore the mess. It's probably what I'd say.
But that's also because you have the functional plasticity that comes in after the first stroke, right? So in that case, the general models that you use to predict longer term outcome don't necessarily apply because things have changed after the first lesion.
Lots changes. Both in terms of recovery as well as decline. And I think, again, that's something that everybody's taking into account. I think that the clinical world is obsessed with only looking at decline, completely discounts recovery. And then the neuroscience world only tends to look at recovery and pretends that there is no atrophy and there is no other issues. So somewhere so I always have this issue both with my publications and my talks. I never you know, everybody seems to say, well, but you're not doing X but you're not doing Y. So yeah, that's the problem with bridging disciplines, is that you end up falling between two chairs often. But that's, you know, if you really want something applied and clinically useful,
you gotta live in both worlds.
Yeah,
you have to straddle the two worlds. You have to bring in the expertise and kind of like knock their heads together and say, come on, we can do this.
This is how you generate your patients. Just knock their heads together and you get more samples.
No, but yeah, the reason we have big numbers and we can do this kind of cool latent class analysis is because it's routine data, right? You'd never get that if you have to put people through an MR, research MR, and give them a 2-hour neuropsych battery. And, you know, then you will get, you know, you get a biased sample, because who can sit through that and who can do all those things? And then, so you'll have bias and then you have small numbers. So you have the two, right? Yeah. But yeah, we have mess and lots of noise.
Well, that's inherent to clinical data, right? It's inherently noisy.
You always have to sacrifice something, right? You can't get the perfect situation. But I think I'm on the streak of I'd rather control for the noise than not know about the, you know, I'd rather know about the noise than pretend it's not there. But
thank you.
You could
Do
argue
you have more, Lilith, or are we moving on?
No, we can move on. Yeah.
We can come back if there's more questions. So Michelle left a question for you, which is asking whether you explored the possibility that two different patterns of lesions that are unconnected can lead to the same neuropsychological observation.
Two different patterns of lesions, same neuropsych observation. It's a good question. We haven't explicitly looked for that. I would think you would find that in that kind of data set. So what my hunch would be that it must be there. But it's a very good question. So I think we could look within each of the latent classes, look at the memberships, I mean, you definitely have different disconnections, right? Because otherwise every class would have a very clear disconnection profile. Clearly they don't. So actually, yeah, there must be tons of them.
Must be, yeah.
Because otherwise every little class would have a very nice little profile to go with it. And yeah, they don't. And I think it's to do with that, like that last little graph. I think, you know, it maybe explains 10, 15% doesn't of the similarity, doesn't explain all the rest.
But you probably would likely find more similar patterns of disconnection than lesion locations, because you could
Yeah,
have lesions to the cortex in different parts of the brain, but they tap into the same.
exactly. So
Yeah.
you find higher proportions, and you can see that in some of the data, but I mean, from here to here, but there's all this space left to improve upon. So
Of course. Fernando
Sorry,
asked,
can I
yeah, sure.
make a question? Sorry. Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation, first of all. And I was wondering about the results that you obtained from a paper, if I remember well, that one of your paper that you presented on the comparison between a CT scan and MRI. And I was wondering about since you found that there seems to be not too different so much between these two techniques, how do you decide, how do you choose the best, of course, also the availability of the instruments, the availability of the data, but how do you choose between these two? Maybe about the lesion profile, about the patient, about the condition, what are the items on which do you decide on which technique you prefer?
I mean, if we have an MR, we'll always delineate on the MR. Like it's just
okay.
It's
Okay, perfect. So it's
cleaner and
about the
easier.
availability. Okay.
Exactly, it's the availability. So the MR is better contrast, more visible, easier to delineate,
Okay.
always. But we have many, 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 many patients that have no MR, and
Yeah,
with very
totally agree.
relevant and informative data in the CT. But yeah, we would always choose the MR. I mean, like anyone else. Like
Okay.
I will never argue for CT over MR, but I will argue that CT has valuable information.
Okay, thank you.
Related to that, there was a question about the comparative study that you started off with, showing CT and MRI scans. And the question was how you can be blind to CT and MRI if the images are clearly different.
Yeah, no, I meant you blind to the ID of the patient. So you don't know the patient ID. So you've seen a CT, you've delineated, you then don't know when you see an MR that it's from the same patient. So you're blinded to the patient identity. Sorry, you obviously know it's an MR, but you don't know that you've already done that one in a CT. Because if we were to do, oh yeah, you do it the MR first and then you do the CT, you'd obviously be hugely biased because you've just seen the scan and you know it's the same patient, so you know where the lesion is. So we had a little program to make sure it was all randomized, and so people got scans in random orders. So they didn't know which patient was which, and they didn't always do MR first and then CT. And we tried as much as possible for them to be as blind as possible to the patient. Sorry, yes, they knew it was an MR.
Were they also blinded to the clinical presentation of the patients?
Yeah, fully. They just saw the scan.
Yeah,
So
okay.
they no ID, no information, just a scan.
Nice.
Yeah.
Another question from Fernando was if aspects about social cognition and theory of mind are assessed as a routine in stroke.
They are not, but they should be. They're part of what we should be assessing. We're working, actually, this is early news, we're working on a social screen, and so are other people. This is something hard to do because people who have done it usually just do like some emotion recognition in kind of very basic way, probably doesn't quite handle it, but it's definitely not done routinely in stroke still. Nowhere that I know of, and there's quite a few people trying to find a solution that is short enough yet usable enough, and that was always our problem as well. There's this, you can do whole batteries, but you won't do that routinely because it takes too long. everything takes too long. Even 15 minutes, people will go, it's quite a long screen, isn't it? You're like, I'm trying my best here, trying so hard.
Pretty good. Pretty good.
It is pretty good. Well, we ended up making a mini ox actually now for the GP surgeries to look at chronic stroke. 8 minutes. We've gone down to 8 minutes because it's a 10-minute appointment.
I was just going to say that's still too long for a 10-minute appointment.
8 minutes.
Hello, here's the test.
Probably to be done by the practice nurse. I think that's where I'll end up. But that's a whole new, very applied stream of work that is not imaging based, but yeah.
You just need a kiosk in the waiting area so they can go through it.
Exactly. So yeah, so we're working on some of that as well with some telehealth stuff in Germany where they have all of these kind of remote clinics and people just come and do a remote assessment. Yeah, it's on the card. All happening. It's all happening. It just takes a while for that to then be out.
So for the classical OX, the 15-minute on the ward.
Standard on the ward one, yeah, that's still the standard
one. Can you just briefly talk us through it? So it's on a tablet.
On paper and pen.
On paper. Okay.
Just on paper. You basically start with some pictures. You say, okay, what are these pictures? Then you ask them to point at something. So the assumption is, okay, patient, you've never seen a patient. You don't know if they can speak. You just approach them and you ask them, what's this? So then first thing you know is, oh, they can speak and they can say, or they can't. And so then the next question is a semantics one. It's just like point to the fruit, point to the tool. So you're trying to see, oh, have they got some understanding? They fail both any speaking and any understanding, you proceed with caution because you're probably going to struggle with the next bit. But so picture naming, understanding, then there's orientation to time and space, which makes perfect sense in my head as one of the first things to know if the patient is oriented. And then we do a quick visual field test. Can they see everywhere? Then we ask them to read a sentence, which is also the memory. So we say, here's the sentence, you'll have to remember it. We read it back to them. So then, even if they couldn't read it all correctly, they at least have it correct in their head. Then they do some number writing, some calculations, a cancellation task across a page. Then we ask them back about the sentence. So it's the delayed recall. Then, God, I'm testing my skills here. I've done many. So delayed recall, then episodic memory. So basically, what did you see before? What have you done in this test? So the non-verbal memory, and then a trail making. The end.
The end. So these are all bedside tests, right?
All bedside, yeah. And literally, you can do them with people who are completely flat, and you hold like a little, clipboard in front of them. Yeah, it can be done with somebody lying flat in bed. It's very, very bedside.
Amazing. Right, I'm aware of time and I don't see any more hands. Last chance if someone wants to say something. No. Okay, in that case, thank you so much for this talk. Brilliant, a lot of food for thought, and we're looking forward to all the new exciting things that you're developing now coming out. And I hope you can enjoy the beautiful sunshine in Oxford for the rest of today.
Looking good. Thanks so much, and sorry for the pace. If anybody needs to watch it back at 0.75 speed, I'm sure that will work.
It's all doable now. It's all there. Thank you so much for joining us today, and hopefully speak to you soon. Everyone else, thanks for joining. Have a great rest of the day or afternoon or morning, depending on where you are in the world, and see you for the next talk next month. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.